The metal walls of the transport ship groaned as it surged forward, cutting through the black void of space. Captain Ethan Cole stood at the bridge's viewport, his eyes fixed on the swirling galaxies beyond, though his mind was elsewhere. The hum of the ship's engines barely reached his ears, drowned out by the deafening silence of betrayal. He was used to orders, to combat, to the weight of command, but this was different. This time, he wasn't leading a battalion into battle. This time, he was being discarded like garbage. The alien fleet, once their allies, now hovered in the distance, their sleek ships a stark contrast to the battered transport Cole commanded. They had promised peace. They had promised cooperation. But that was before the humans had become an inconvenience, before they had outlived their usefulness. Final destination, Lyrian. A voice crackled over the intercom, cold and detached. Lyrian. The Deathworld. No one had survived there, not until now. Ethan's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. How the hell did it come to this? He muttered under his breath. Behind him, Dr. Nadia Ferris entered the bridge, her footsteps light but purposeful. Her eyes, always sharp with curiosity, were clouded with anxiety now. She approached Ethan silently, her gaze flicking to the viewport. She didn't need to ask where his mind was. She already knew. "We can still turn this around," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Ethan shook his head. "We don't have the luxury of turning back. Not anymore." He turned away from the window and moved towards the holographic map displayed on the center console. The dim blue lights from the map illuminated his features, casting harsh shadows on his face. He pointed to the planet they were descending toward. "Lyrian's a hellscape. Temperatures that could melt steel. Creatures that tear apart anything with flesh. And it's a one-way trip. No going back." Nadia's face softened, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that wasn't fear. It was curiosity. "You think we can survive it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he activated the data feed on the console, bringing up a series of terrifying statistics about the planet's hostile conditions. The numbers didn't lie. Lyrian was a place where nothing should have lived, and everything that did only survived through sheer violence and brutality. "We will. Because we have to," he replied at last, his tone heavy with finality. Lieutenant Marco Hayes, who had been standing at the back of the room, observing, stepped forward. He crossed his arms and scoffed. "Lyrian? A death world? Come on, Captain. I've faced worse. Hell, we all have." Ethan looked at Marco, his steely gaze meeting the younger soldier's. Marco's confidence was both a strength and a liability, but Ethan couldn't afford to let him get reckless now. "This isn't about fighting," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "This is about surviving. We're not dealing with enemies we can shoot or outmaneuver. We're dealing with an entire ecosystem built to kill. This is a test of our will, and our wits." Marco's face tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded once, as if accepting that the reality of the situation was sinking in. "Understood, sir." The ship rattled as it broke through the planet's atmosphere, jolting everyone forward in their seats. The tension in the air thickened, each person instinctively bracing for impact. The ship's hull screeched in protest, but it held together, spiraling toward the unforgiving surface below. Nadia glanced out the viewport again. "Look at the energy readings," she murmured, her finger tracing a pattern on the console. "There's something strange about the atmosphere here, an anomaly. Could be interference from the planet's magnetic fields," Marco suggested, his voice tinged with skepticism. "No." Nadia shook her head, her brow furrowed in thought. "This isn't natural. It's almost as if the planet itself is alive. The energy fluctuates too erratically for it to be any regular phenomenon." Ethan frowned. "We don't have time to investigate that right now. Let's just focus on getting through the landing." The ship bucked again, the roar of wind outside filling the cabin as they hurtled toward the ground. The control panel flashed with warnings, but Ethan didn't panic. He had led his men through much worse. "Brace for impact," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. The world outside seemed to collapse as the ship's tail hit the ground, sending a bone-rattling jolt through the passengers. Metal screamed, and the ship groaned under the strain as it skidded across the harsh terrain, finally coming to a violent halt. Silence. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced around the room. Nadia and Marco were already unbuckling, checking themselves for injuries. He did the same, then moved to the airlock. "Stay alert," he ordered. "We have no idea what we're dealing with here." The doors to the ship hissed open, and a gust of hot, dry wind greeted them. The planet's surface was a patchwork of jagged rocks and sand, stretching endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. The air tasted metallic, sharp against the skin. Ethan squinted into the harsh glare of the alien sun. It felt like the land itself was watching them, waiting. Nadia, ever the scientist, scanned the horizon. "I can't believe this place is real. It's like something out of a nightmare." "It's real," Marco said flatly. "And it's our new home. So let's make it work or we die." Ethan turned to face them. His crew, his people, looked to him now, not just for guidance, but for hope. He squared his shoulders, staring into the vast unknown. "This is it. Lyrian's got one rule: survive. And we will. We'll make it out of here, one way or another." The silence stretched, and for a moment, the weight of the planet's hostility hung heavy on them all. But Ethan didn't falter. He couldn't afford to. They stepped into the unforgiving landscape, and the world of Lyrian began to reveal its first deadly secrets. The moment the ship's doors opened, the air hit them like a hammer, a dry, searing wind that made Ethan's skin tingle with the unnatural warmth of the planet. He squinted into the violent red sky, feeling the sun's heat burn through the thin fabric of his uniform. The ground beneath them was cracked and barren, as if it had been scorched by centuries of neglect. Only jagged rocks and sparse, twisted flora punctuated the endless stretch of dust. Ethan scanned the horizon, noting the lack of movement. No signs of life. No immediate threats. Yet something about the stillness gnawed at him, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. "We need to find shelter," Nadia said, her voice cutting through the silence. She had already unstrapped her field pack and was adjusting her visor to scan the surroundings. Her eyes were wide, absorbing every detail. She looked like a scientist on a mission, but there was something else in her eyes now: uncertainty, fear, maybe even a little awe. She was as out of her depth as they all were, but Nadia always hid it behind her analytical mind. "Agreed," Ethan replied, his tone sharp. He felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He was their leader, their only hope for survival in this alien hellscape. The responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was no room for doubt now. They had to push forward. "Marco, take point." Marco grinned, as though this were another mission on another world. His youthful confidence made him a perfect soldier, but here, in Lyrian, it was a dangerous attitude. "I'm on it, Captain." Ethan watched Marco move ahead, his steps kicking up puffs of dust as he advanced. The man had no fear of the unknown, which was both a gift and a curse in this environment. Nadia and Ethan followed, each step bringing them deeper into the desolation. They walked in silence, the only sound the scrape of their boots against the parched earth. The air smelled faintly of sulfur, and the sun's heat intensified as they moved farther from the shelter of the ship. "I can't believe they just left us here," Nadia muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "After everything, we were supposed to be allies. And now we're expendable." Ethan didn't answer immediately. His mind was already at work, calculating their next moves, formulating contingency plans. He couldn't afford to get bogged down by anger. But Nadia's words rang true. This was betrayal, pure and simple. The aliens had promised humanity cooperation, but when the humans' usefulness waned, they'd been discarded. Sentenced to die on this god-forsaken planet. It had been a swift decision, no trial, no explanation. Just orders. Disbanded. Exiled. Forgotten. But Ethan wouldn't forget. He wouldn't let his team die here. Not like this. "We survive," he said, his voice firm. That's all that matters now. Nadia gave him a sideways glance, then nodded. Right. Survive. After a few hours of walking, the landscape grew increasingly hostile. The air seemed to press down on them, suffocating in its intensity. The sun, an unrelenting red orb, hung low in the sky, casting long, exaggerated shadows across the terrain. Ethan felt his skin burning, his throat dry despite the hydration packs. Suddenly, Marco stopped. Got something? He called, his voice low but urgent. Ethan moved forward quickly, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. But it wasn't an enemy he was looking at, it was a massive formation of rocks, arranged in an unnatural circle, as though someone, or something, had placed them that way. Ethan studied the rocks carefully. An alien structure? Nadia asked, crouching beside him. Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe this is a natural formation. Either way, it's the only cover we've got. They moved closer, the rocks casting deep shadows on the ground. The air here was cooler, a slight reprieve from the blistering heat outside the circle. But there was still something off about the place, an unsettling energy in the stillness. Marco crouched down beside one of the rocks and tapped it lightly with his knuckles. Hollow, he muttered. I think we might have found shelter after all. Let's check it out, Ethan said. He gave Marco a nod, and the two soldiers moved forward, carefully stepping inside the ring of rocks. Nadia hesitated for a moment, scanning the horizon one last time before following them. Inside the formation, the temperature dropped even further, and the air tasted sweeter. It was as though they had stepped into a pocket of relative calm amid the harsh environment. The rocks were jagged but smooth in places, and the floor was covered in fine, dark sand. In the center of the circle was a small, deep pit. What is this place? Nadia whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Ethan squatted beside the pit, peering inside. His fingers brushed the edges of the hole, his breath catching in his throat as he touched something cold, smooth, and metallic. The pit wasn't natural at all, it was man-made, or rather, alien-made. His pulse quickened. They weren't the first to land on this planet. Look at this, he muttered, pulling back slightly to examine the markings along the edge. Alien symbols, runes he didn't recognize, covered the metallic surface, spiraling inward like an ancient seal. Nadia stepped closer, her eyes wide with fascination. Do you think it's a portal of some kind? Ethan could only shake his head. Maybe. Or it could be a trap. Before they could discuss further, a low rumble echoed from beneath their feet. The ground shuddered. Marco was the first to react, reaching for his weapon. What the hell was that? The rumble intensified. The pit seemed to shift, as though it were waking up. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone. Someone, was coming. Ethan raised his hand, signaling for them to get ready. Weapons up. We don't know what's down there. The sound of scraping metal reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. Then, from the depths of the pit, something emerged. It was large, shadowed in the dim light, its silhouette slowly taking shape against the red horizon. The unknown had arrived. And Lyrian had just become even more dangerous. The ground rumbled beneath Ethan's boots as the creature's silhouette took form in the fading light. His hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his sidearm, but he hesitated. The figure emerging from the pit wasn't what he had expected, not an alien beast, not some grotesque monstrosity from the depths of a dark universe. No, this was something far more troubling. The thing, if it could even be called that, was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. It towered at least 7 feet tall, its frame lean and wiry. Its skin shimmered, almost translucent, with veins pulsing faintly beneath. A mass of dark tendrils writhed from its back like a swarm of hungry insects. As it moved, the air seemed to distort, a shimmering heat rising around its body. Nadia was the first to react, taking a step back and raising her hand in a gesture of both caution and curiosity. What is that? Her voice barely reached above a whisper, but Ethan could hear the trembling awe behind it. She had a scientific mind, a thirst for knowledge, but this? This defied explanation. I don't know, Ethan replied, his voice tight. But we can't stick around to find out. Everyone fall back. Marco, however, stayed rooted to the spot. His eyes were wide with fascination, not fear. It's alive. It's here. His tone was almost reverent. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had known Marco was reckless, but this was worse than anything he had feared. Marco, I said, fall back. Now. The strange being raised one long arm, the tendrils twisting in the air like serpents. As if it had heard him, it paused, the tension in the air thickening. For a moment, Ethan thought they had made a mistake, maybe it wasn't hostile. But then, the creature's head tilted to one side, its glowing eyes locking onto Ethan. It was a chilling gaze, one that sent a jolt of fear through his chest. There was intelligence there, but no warmth. Only cold calculation. Before anyone could react, the creature's voice echoed in their minds, sharp and clear. You are not supposed to be here. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. A telepath. Did you hear that? Nadia whispered, wide-eyed. Everyone keep your distance, Ethan ordered, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. He had heard of telepathic species before, but he had never encountered one. They were dangerous, difficult to read, impossible to predict. This one, though, wasn't speaking to them through normal channels. Its words felt more like a demand, an assertion of control. The creature raised its arms, and for a moment it looked as though it were about to attack. But instead, it turned its gaze toward the pit. Ethan followed its eyes. The pit had changed. The metallic walls of the hole were beginning to pulse with light, an eerie, rhythmic glow that hummed through the air. The ground beneath them shifted again, the rumbling growing louder, more violent. A crack split the ground. A dark fissure opened wide, stretching toward them. We need to move, now! Ethan barked, already backing away from the opening. The creature, however, wasn't interested in their retreat. Its eyes followed them, unmoving, as the tendrils flared like wings. The hum grew louder, vibrating through Ethan's bones. His instinct was to run, but something deep within him held him in place. The sense of danger had heightened. This wasn't just an alien, this was something far older, far more dangerous. As the rift in the ground widened, something started to emerge from the depths, shapes, indistinct and shifting. Ethereal forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were coming. Fall back! Ethan shouted again, turning to face his team. But Marco didn't budge. His expression was no longer one of fascination, it was of awe, like a disciple watching the divine unfold before them. You don't understand, Marco muttered, stepping forward. This is what we were meant to find. This is the true legacy of the universe. The answers to everything. Ethan's heart raced as he moved toward Marco, grabbing him by the arm and yanking him back. You don't know what this is, Marco. This is dangerous. His voice was harsh, desperate. But Marco only smiled, that same reckless grin on his face. But before Ethan could react further, the creature, the guardian perhaps, moved. Its tendrils lashed out, not toward them, but toward the opening in the ground. It pulled something from the darkness, something vast and dark, a shape that seemed to pulse with power, with untapped potential. Ethan's breath caught. The figure began to take shape, first a body, then limbs, then a head, rising from the depths. This wasn't just a creature. It was something more. A colossal, sentient being, ancient and full of power. The words came again, this time more insistent. You are not supposed to be here. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't just an alien artifact. This was something ancient, an entity far beyond human understanding. Its presence weighed heavily on him, making the air thick, suffocating. But then, to his horror, Marco stepped forward again. It's calling me, he whispered, his eyes glazed over in some kind of trance. I have to go. No! Nadia cried, reaching out for him, but it was too late. Marco had already stepped into the rift, vanishing into the darkness below. "Ethan, we can't just leave him!" Nadia shouted, her voice trembling with panic. He didn't answer immediately, his thoughts a jumbled mess. Marco was gone. He had willingly walked into the mouth of some unknown entity. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, to stop him, but deep down, Ethan knew they couldn't fight what was coming. Not yet. "Get to the ship," Ethan ordered, pulling Nadia back. "We need to regroup." The ground shook violently again as the creature lifted its head toward the sky. The world around them darkened, and the shadows lengthened. From the depths of the rift, the ancient presence called again, and Ethan realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. They were no longer in control. The air was thick with tension as Ethan and Nadia sprinted through the dense forest, the hum of alien machinery growing louder with each step. Their feet pounded the soft earth, the leaves brushing against their legs, but neither of them looked back. Marco had vanished into the rift, swallowed by the darkness. And now, the true weight of their situation was crashing down on them. "Ethan, we can't leave him!" Nadia's voice was strained, almost desperate. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept pace with him, her eyes darting nervously over the landscape. "We don't have a choice," Ethan snapped, glancing back briefly. The horizon was darkening, the once blue sky now an ominous shade of red. Something was wrong, everything was wrong. The ground beneath them vibrated, and the air felt thick with an unholy energy. "We can't save him, not like this. But we can't just let that thing take him," she shouted, her eyes wide with panic. She was struggling to understand, to accept the reality of the situation, but Ethan knew the truth. Marco had made his choice. And now, they had to survive. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the distance. The sound of something enormous shifting, the forest trembling under its weight. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The creature, the one that had emerged from the rift, was closing in on them. It was only a matter of time before it found them. "Run!" Ethan urged, his voice rising over the growing hum of the rift. They had to make it to the ship. They had to leave before the alien forces fully awakened. As they broke through the last line of trees, the ship loomed ahead, its sleek, silver form glinting in the dimming light. But something was wrong. It wasn't the pristine vessel they had left behind. The surface was scarred, as though something massive had clawed at it. The hatch was open, but the interior was dark. Abandoned. "Ethan!" Nadia's voice faltered. She was staring at the ship, her face pale as she stepped closer, dread creeping into her expression. "Stay close," he commanded, gripping her shoulder tightly. His eyes scanned the surroundings, alert. The danger wasn't just the alien creature, they were being hunted. The energy in the air was palpable, thick with an unknown force. They reached the ship's entrance and stepped inside, but the silence inside was deafening. The hum of the alien machine was gone now, replaced by the soft click of Ethan's boots against the metal floor. He moved quickly, pulling Nadia toward the cockpit. As he entered, his breath caught in his throat. The control panel was smashed, buttons cracked, wires hanging loose. "What the hell happened?" Nadia whispered, her voice quivering. "We're not leaving in this ship," Ethan muttered, his mind racing. "We have to find another way off this planet." Suddenly, the ship's exterior groaned, a low, mechanical sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine. The doors hissed as they slid closed with unnatural speed, locking them inside. No. This wasn't a malfunction. Someone, or something, had sealed them in. "Ethan," Nadia began, her voice shaking. "We're trapped." The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. The oppressive silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with static. Then, the lights snapped back on. And they weren't alone. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Ethan's pulse spiked as he swung around, his hand reaching for his weapon, only to find nothing. He cursed under his breath, but the shadow moved again, closer this time, revealing a familiar figure. Marco. But this wasn't the Marco they had known. His eyes were wide, glazed over, and his skin had taken on an unnatural, pale hue. He moved with jerky, inhuman motions, his limbs stiff and mechanical. As he stepped into the light, Ethan saw the tendrils of the creature wrapped around his neck, like serpents, pulsing with eerie energy. "Marco!" Nadia cried, rushing forward, but Ethan caught her arm. "No!" he hissed. "Stay back." Marco's head tilted toward them, his lips stretching into a grotesque grin. "It's too late, Ethan." His voice was distorted, hollow. You can't stop it. You can't fight it." Ethan took a step forward, his mind reeling. Marco wasn't Marco anymore. The creature had taken him, used him as a vessel. But Ethan wasn't about to let it take any more from them. "Get away from him!" Ethan shouted, his eyes narrowing. He scanned the room, desperate for something, anything, to help them escape. But Marco's laughter echoed through the chamber, twisted and foreign. "Escape? There's no escape," he rasped, his voice now a chorus of many. "You can't outrun what you don't understand." With a sudden, violent motion, Marco lunged, his arms outstretched, the tendrils trailing behind him like an extension of the alien force controlling him. Ethan barely had time to react. He shoved Nadia aside just as Marco reached for him, his fingers curling into claws. There was a flash of movement, a blur of energy, and then Marco was thrown back, crashing against the ship's interior with a sickening thud. "Stay down!" Ethan ordered Nadia, his heart hammering in his chest. He rushed toward Marco, his hands moving quickly to free him from whatever hell had taken hold of him. But it was no use. Marco's body was racked with spasms, and the tendrils lashed out like whips, striking with terrifying precision. Ethan ducked just in time, his heart pounding as he scrambled to pull Nadia to safety. The ship was shaking now, the entire structure groaning under the weight of the alien presence that had infiltrated their vessel. The lights flickered again, and then, silence. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. And then the voice, cold, alien, and omnipresent, rang out in their minds. "You have awakened us." Ethan froze, his mind spinning. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. They had awoken something ancient. Something beyond their comprehension. And it wasn't going to stop until it had everything.